Πριν από μερικούς μήνες ολοκληρώθηκε η διαδικασία για το PSI. Η χώρα μας ξεκίνησε με 172%. Χρέος πήγε στο 152% και ετοιμαζόμαστε να κλείσουμε το 2012 πάλι γύρω στο 170%. Γιατί το κάναμε αυτό? Και αν πρόκειται να πάμε σε ένα νέο κούρεμα, σε ένα OSI, στο οποίο να συμπεριλαμβάνεται φερειπίν και η Ευρωπαϊκή Κεντρική Τράπεζα και οι επίσημοι δανειστές μας στο μέλλον, θα μας ωφελήσει? Πού θα βγει αυτή η κατάσταση? Σήμερα μαζί μας βρίσκεται ο Mr. PSI, ο Ρόμπερτ Apfel, ο άνθρωπος με τον οποίο ήρθαν σε επαφή οι δανειστές μας για να μεσολαβήσει στην ελληνική κυβέρνηση. Είναι αυτός που έχουμε μάθει να καλούμε Mr. PSI και συνομιλούμε απόψε μαζί του ευθέως. Well, Mr. Apfel, it's very nice to have you here. Thank you so much. How do you like Greece?
It's a fantastic country. Thank you.
Is it the first time you're in Greece?
No, I arrived in Greece around October of last year at the beginning of the PSI, and I pretty much was aboard through the closing of the operation towards the end of April.
Why do they call you Mr. PSI? Are you really so central in the whole process?
My expertise is the mechanics of the securities industry. I created the mechanics by which the bonds were created, and when Greece was reaching out to its investors to ask them to take a haircut, there were close to 50,000 of these investors. So I was the one that took that message, that request to the 50,000. I was the one that brought back their responses, that conducted the votes, and that ultimately brought the new instruments into their hands. So me and the people that work with me from my firm and my colleagues were the ones that executed this enormous debt reduction, the largest in history.
The largest ever, but at the end of it, did it come to any avail? I mean, why did we do it? We started with 172 debt to GDP ratio. We went to 150 something, and we're going to have an end here, end 2012, around 170. So it doesn't really make sense.
Oh, I see. You know what the future will be in November or December?
Well,
I'm asking you this question.
That's exactly what Ernst & Young has predicted about the end of 2012, which is in a couple of months' time. I mean, it's going to be a really high...
Oh, really? The oracles at Delphi have spoken. They've said that our... you see, my point here is that the future is not... I'm in business. And in business, we use a T account. We look at assets, we look at liabilities. We look at revenues, we look at expenses. Now, what you're saying is that our revenues will be X and our expenses will be Y. But I ask you, why? Why do you know this?
Because I do not expect something dramatic to happen till the end of this year. Do you?
I believe that you and I and the rest of the millions of people here are humans, and we can influence the outcomes. Yes, I'm not saying that a miracle will happen. I'm not saying that the economy will shoot up. But what I will say, though, is that anyone who presupposes to know the future shouldn't be listened to.
Let's talk about the past then. It seems that after the PSI, Greek debt actually ended not being really reduced, but changing hands. I mean, what happened is that the multitude of the Greek debt changed hands from international FIs, banks, and actually ended up in Greek hands. Was this good for Greece?
I'm not sure that it all ended up back in Greek hands. There's a fair amount of Greek debt that's still outside of Greece. But the character of the debt changed. It moved from debt that was due in 3 or 4 years to debt that's due in 30 years.
But it also moved to the Greek government. I mean, from around 200 billion, we went down to 92. But then we needed another 25 and another 35 so as to recapitalize the Greek banks, plus another 10 because of the losses of the securities, and then we end up with 160 again as a burden on the Greek government?
That burden is now spread out over 30 years. One thing I will point out, let me ask you, if you buy a house that will last you for 10 or 20 or 30 years, would you get a loan for 2 or 3 years? The answer is probably not.
Exactly.
For some reason. If you look at the Greek debt that was borrowed over the last 10 years, the Italian debt, the Spanish debt, these governments and corporations all borrow short-term, which is not a very rational approach.
But do our lenders, do international institutions, do the markets, the so-called markets, really trust Greeks? Can we actually repay what we have borrowed in the next 20 or 30 years? I mean, they don't really trust us when it comes to 2014.
Greece has defaulted 7 or 8 times since independence. If past is any predictor of the future, the answer is clearly no. However, one can equally ask, are we doomed to repeat the past in the future? And that, I think, is a question for rational and intelligent people. Must we step into the shoes of our fathers? Or can we create our own shoes and walk our own path?
Do you actually believe that societies such as the Greek one can change?
I believe that the society is a collection of 12 or 13 million people. In fact, this was a principle that Abraham Lincoln believed in very much. Abraham Lincoln walked around with Euclid's 6 books of geometry. And Lincoln looked through the government to the hundreds of millions of people on the other side of our elected officials. The government intermediary was just a stopping point. Abraham Lincoln, like Euclid, and he was taught to speak logically off of reading Euclid, as did Jefferson.
But the U.S. at the time was a young state, full of energy and drive. And Greece at the moment is not at all in those shoes. It is a very tired nation, worn down by austerity.
The nation perhaps is worn down by austerity and by a belief. I think it's worn down by the common statements of those outside that it's a failure. You know, if you are a young man as a student and every day you get a B or a C in your classes and not an A, after doing this for 5 or 10 years, if people tell you you're no good, you will start to believe that you are no good. And this is the big issue I see for Greece, a common pervasive view, a psyche of failure, a preparation in advance already for failure, rather than a dream for success.
Is that what you see in Greece?
It's what I see in the people of Greece. I believe that people, they look at doors and they say that those doors, they don't even try to open the doors to see what's on the other side. They assume that they're locked.
How can people have hope? I mean, let's go back. I said 10 million securities. I actually meant pension funds losses.
Yes.
How can people that don't really know whether they're going to be getting a pension that can get them through the month have hope? And part of the reason that they cannot really hope to get a pension that will get them through the month is the losses of the pension funds after the PSI.
Yes, the pension funds have been hit very hard by participating. However, I'm a financial man. Let me answer this in financial terms. When a financial situation looks bad or adverse, or you're picking your shots in the market, you go for what you think is going to be the strongest option. You try to leverage the strongest assets. And I believe that instead of focusing on the negative side, the glass half empty, if we focus on filling up that glass and leveraging what assets we have, we will secure a future that may surprise all of us.
As to the future, many people say that there is no chance that Greece will manage to remain in the Eurozone. Part of the reason that led to the PSI in the first place was exactly for Greece to have debt sustainability such that will allow it to remain in the Eurozone. But it doesn't seem that we have achieved that, does it?
Certainly reducing the debt alone has not produced a positive result. As you're saying, our debt relative to GDP is going up. Even though the debt may not be going up, the GDP is going down.
Exactly. So
it's very simple. Any child in a playground knows that it's like a seesaw. When one thing goes up, something else goes down. We have a choice. We can either only reduce the debt, or we can grow our revenues. And if you look at all of the... I'm sorry?
Oh, no, please go ahead.
If you look at all of the focus of those who are commenting on the Greek economy, if you look at those who are working on the Greek economy, look at the degrees that they have. They've all studied one subject, economics. I studied economics. And what is the tool of the man in economics? Regression analysis. Multiple regression analysis, which is a technique to study the events in the past, and you assemble the results in the past to predict the future.
But there has not been in the past such a debt swap as the one that you managed to execute with the Greek PSI. So...
Well, there have been many debt swaps in the past. There was a debt swap in 1898, just 2 years after the first Olympics. There were debt swaps after the first financing by the Rothschilds back in 1831 or 1832, I think, the first loan. The first loan, I think, was a brilliant loan. Very few people in Greece even know about it. But the money from that loan was used in part to buy 50,000 farms for 50,000 families. Not to give them to the families, but to sell them for 2,000 drachmas a farm.
When was that?
1833.
There you go.
Your first president, Kapodistas,
yes.
he was part of the design of this technique. And they gave to all the farmers, as part of the package, plants for mulberry trees. And you know what the mulberry trees...
Yes, absolutely.
You produce silkworms. Then they built factories to produce the silk. So this was a financing program organized around economic growth, which could actually, and within a few years of independence, Greece had a 2-to-1 trade surplus.
Speak of surplus and speak of an economy that does well. Let's go to the direct opposite, which is the Greek economy that does not do well. You have the IMF paradox right now. You apply austerity by forcing measures, and then you say that they don't work, then throwing the ball to the Germans, saying that you need an extra haircut. Does this make any sense?
Well, again, it sounds like the players on this team, is this basketball or football? They're throwing the ball. It seems like they were all graduates of the same school. They're all economists. And again, the team of the economist is to predict the future revenues. And because we cannot predict, the economist is not a businessman. He's not a visionary. He's not an entrepreneur. He studies the past and uses that alone to predict the future. 2,500 years ago, your people went into battle. Before the battle, they consulted the oracle and asked if it was a good or bad time. If the oracle said step back, you step back. The economists are the oracles of today.
2,500 years ago, my, so to speak, ancestors went into battle, and Tom Holland, the historian from Oxford, says that this is the beginning of the Western civilization, the Western tradition. Is Greece part of the West nowadays?
Greece, one of your ancestors, Pericles, said that what the Greeks left behind was not marble temples, but elements of culture that are woven into the fabric of Western civilization. And if you travel through Europe or the Americas and you see democracy, philosophy, physics, logic, drama, you ask me, have the Greeks left a legacy that has touched the world? The answer is
exactly
yes.
What
it
I'm
touches
asking.
every student.
Yes, but how about nowadays? How about the present? How about today? Is Greece part of the West? And does the West see Greece as an integral part of it?
It's a good question. Certainly many people in the West know that democracy was invented here. But in order to build on this development, one must herald it, one must venerate it. This democracy thing is a remarkable achievement.
Exactly, but they already have democracy. They don't need present time nowadays Greece in order for them to apply democracy, so they can do it without us. Do they need Greece nowadays? Is it possible for Greece not to be regarded anymore as part of the West, as part of the Euro-Atlantic world?
First off, we should not take democracy for granted. We need to understand where it came from in order to make sure that we have it 100 years from now. It lasted only 200 years during the classical times here in Greece. The democracy form in Greece was a remarkable form. Very few people are aware that you had an assembly here of 6,000 people that were not elected. They were selected by lot. It was a requirement on every free man that he serve in this ecclesia. And in fact, you had a Greek word that identified people who didn't serve.
Idiot.
An idiot.
Exactly.
One who looks only upon himself.
From the Greek verb idiotevo. But still you have not answered my question. Yes. It is very flattering that you know all this on our heritage. But the question is, how likely is it that the West will at the end pull out of Greece? How likely do you find it that they will kick us out of the euro once we have done all the haircuts and the PSIs and the OSIs and the debt is back in Greek hands, so the banks are safe and then the Greeks are just thrown out of the club?
To me, Greece has always been here, lodged between the Adriatic and the Aegean, and it will be here, it's been here 1 million years or 2 million, it will be here another 2 million. You're asking me what currency will people be using here, and to that I say it is not relevant. Currency as we know it today, money, was invented in Lydia in Turkey in 600 BC, and within 50 years we will probably stop using things called euros and drachmas and dollars. We are moving already in many parts of the world to electronic currencies. The Bill Gates Foundation is spending $1 billion over the course of 5 years promoting the advent of currencies that are transferable off of mobiles. Your question is not what currency, or it shouldn't be, what currency are we using? The question is, do we believe that there's some value here in Greece that is worth living for? Is there something that we have created that we can leverage, that can produce value for the world? You studied philosophy in England. Philosophy was invented here in Greece. One of my goals is to take a plot of land which today is an empty park, not in good condition. It's called Plato's Academy. This area of Plato, and to bring it back to what it was back then, a place where learning was venerated.
It may seem to you that the currency is not a real question, but nowadays for the Greeks, whether we're going to stay or not in the euro is the question. Robert Apfel, let me take a break and we'll be right back. Επιστρέφουμε σε λίγα δευτερόλεπτα. Ευθέως και επιστρέφουμε με τον άνθρωπο ο οποίος έχει αποκληθεί Mr. PSI. Είναι ο άνθρωπος ο οποίος μεσολάβησε μεταξύ των τραπεζών, των αγορών και της ελληνικής κυβέρνησης, ούτως ώστε να γίνει το περίφημο PSI. Έχει πέσει έξω, χρειαζόμαστε καινούριο κούρεμα. Είναι η Ελλάδα μέρος της Δύσης, ακλόνητο. Συνεχίζουμε τη συζήτησή μας. So, what we were discussing was whether Greece is an integral part of the West. 200 years ago, that was not the case. I mean, Europe went up to Vienna, and Greece was a part of the Ottoman Empire. In the beginning of the third millennium...
I don't believe that. Italy is a free country today because Garibaldi was in love with the principles of democracy. He unified Italy. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and John Adams were in love with the principles of democracy.
But what about the Greek people?
The Greek influence in the world is enormous, and the Greek people today believe that all is lost. The world has told them that they're failures. The world has told them that they have no value. They have no future. And you know what? If we continue to focus only on cutting, we will produce the result that only cutting can produce, which is a disaster. It will result in poverty and sadness, because on the subject of the PSI, your numbers are correct. We still have too much debt to be paid off with an economy that is going nowhere.
Do we need an extra haircut?
No, we don't. Look, any idiot can cut. It takes genius to build.
But what about cutting at the moment? Because it seems that we don't have...
Oh, it's easy to cut. Yes, you just cut. Yes, and then once you're done cutting, what have you got? If you cut an olive tree into 100 different pieces, at the end you have nothing that grows.
In the IMF, Europe, or better put, Germany rift, who's right?
I think nobody is right. Again, the people who are debating this, they all are looking at it from an econometric standpoint. They're trying to predict the future based on the past. I believe that the only way out of the disastrous result that we have predicted now is to raise the spirits of the Greek people. When Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated in 1932 as president, you remember his inaugural address, and he said to the people of the U.S., with 30% unemployment, that the only thing we have to fear really is fear itself. And when Greek people say to me, Bob, what's the future of Greece? I say, look in the mirror and look at the eyes of your children. You're looking at the future of Greece.
That's so romantic, but fascism and the extremes are taking control on the Athenian street.
Children are not fascist.
Children are afraid. That's what you see in children's eyes.
There's a beautiful story told that was created by a famous journalist. You know his name, Jacob Pulitzer.
Yes.
In the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the people of France created a statue of liberty. They built this statue, and they gave it as a gift to the people of America to celebrate 100 years of liberty. But New York wanted the statue, Philadelphia, Washington, but nobody had any money. And for 5 years, that statue sat in a park in Paris, waiting for money to bring it to America.
Is there a Statue of Liberty addressed to Greece that Greece has not grabbed?
This journalist, he opened up the pages of his newspaper to children, and he said, send little money, little amounts of money, 10 cents, 50 cents, and contribute to bringing the statue that celebrates liberty and freedom. Bring the statue to America. And what had taken old people 5 or 6 years to do, Pulitzer and 320,000 children finished in 3 months.
That actually requires for the people to trust the government. And the people do not trust the government, but let me...
Exactly. They don't trust the government, and Margaret Thatcher...
They don't trust the state. They don't trust the politicians as a whole.
Big. Right.
So how can you have a success story out of such a country?
I worked for Margaret Thatcher and her team during the privatization program. And this woman, a shopkeeper's daughter, had the right approach. People didn't trust the government. They felt that it was inefficient. They had 2 people working in jobs that needed 1. But the people were opposed to cutting back excess jobs because they didn't understand. They didn't understand because they weren't part. And this woman embarked on a privatization program.
What should the Greek government do right now?
When Margaret Thatcher privatized, she started with 400,000 British families owning stock. People that owned stock were the rich, and the poor didn't own stock. When she finished, there were 12 million British families that owned shares. She converted over 11 million people, from people who were opposed to her policies to those who supported because they had a financial stake in the future.
Speak of the UK. The UK is not part of the euro. Will the EU manage to save the euro?
Again, I don't care, because at the end, no matter what currency you have, if your goat isn't producing milk and you cannot sell the milk for cash, or you cannot give it to your neighbor in exchange for seeds, you will starve. You need to produce something to live. So the currency is just a surrogate.
Just one last technical question. What's the truth in the statement that says that the Grexit would actually begin a domino effect that would see Europe crumble down?
I believe totally in that. The markets, as we know them today, are highly concentrated. You could take all of the debt of Spain or Italy and find that over 50% of the debt is owned by fewer than 100 investors.
So this is a card that Greece can play?
It's a card that will impact the world. The world is scared of an exit because the ownership of securities is so limited. One of the things that Greece and the ECB and Europe must do is to expand the ownership of securities to eliminate the domino effect, to eliminate the earthquake effect of events that could influence the markets.
Mr. Apfel, thank you so much for this conversation.
It's my pleasure.
All the best.
Thank you.
Παρακολουθήσαμε μια συζήτηση αποκαλυπτική. Προσπαθήσαμε να θέσουμε τα θέματα ευθέως, τα συμπεράσματα δικά σας. Καλή σας νύχτα.